from the geologist point of view, is there a big difference between interpreting onshore geophysical data and discovering oil and gas and doing it in the offshore setting? What are the key differences, or is it exactly the same, like if you interpret the data?
No. The interpretation is much the same. The acquisition is different in that offshore you can make good progress in reasonable weather with a boat and with no physical restraints, whereas onshore one tends to have many barriers. If you're in an area that's populated, that gives you problems. When you're trying to lay out seismic lines, the whole job tends to get more cumbersome and more problematic.
So you get the mapping way faster done.
But the actual interpretation and the geology is much the same. But no, as I was saying, one of my first jobs was to write a report on the Celtic Sea. That would have been about 1971. And then in 1972 we set up a...
That's looking at the offshore seismic.
Offshore seismic. And then in 1972 we set up the first seismic shoot in Porcupine Basin with one of the... We did a joint operation with one of the seismic companies, the French CGG, and shot a number of lines for sale to the industry, for open sale to the industry, with an accompanying report. So that was my first involvement really in the Irish offshore, and here we are more than 40 years later, and we're still waiting for the big oil find. So the whole business of the improvement of technology I find quite fascinating. When I first started work in Africa, and particularly, but also even in the north of Canada, we had very little support in terms of technical support. We had in Africa rather poor air photographs, no detailed maps. You have to make your own maps as you went. And even in northern Canada we had air photos, but only half-inch, rather crude maps. But in Canada, of course, we were using helicopters now. So the operation was speeding up. The mapping was done from a helicopter directly onto.
You mean the geophysics or just the aerial
photography? No, just the geology, the surface geology was.
So it wasn't
largely unknown.
Like, there wasn't geological survey there, like
no, that's right. So that we were doing detailed mapping. So that was. But when I came back to London, even the level of technical support, I was consulting on a boat in Sierra Leone where we used the first satellite. Some of the first satellite equipment for offshore seismic work, and rather crude, large pieces of equipment. I mean, one of the bugbears for geologists for generations was map scales, the changing of map scales. It sounds ridiculous now, but if one wanted to put, let's say, detailed mapping from one scale onto a smaller scale map, everything had to be done with large photographic desks. Chevron, who could afford equipment, had the best equipment, but it consisted of taking a photograph and using various levers and so on to scale down. The scaling maps, now it's on a computer.
Yeah, you just zoom in, zoom out.
You can do that instantly, but that was a real problem. The making of maps and even...
And you can overlay different data sets, like...
And putting photographs into your thesis if you were at university. It had to be done with paper. You had to take the photograph, it had to be developed, it had to be stuck into your thesis to be part of the thesis. So a lot of things improved, but I think people tend to underestimate how recent much of the change has been. When I was working in Dublin in the 80s and up to 1990, it was still a requirement in North Sea operators agreements that the operator for a group of companies would send out messages by telex. Now, I don't know if anyone under about 30 has ever seen a telex machine, but it's they were in every office. Every company had a telex number. A telex was a keyboard operation which you could either do in real time, directly to someone sitting at a telex at the other end who would respond to you, or you could put onto a tape and play through a long message to somebody at the other side. Telexes were everywhere, and next year they were nowhere. They and faxes came in the late 80s in a big way, and faxes are going the same way now. They've almost gone.
Because the email replaced
it. It's not necessary.
But yeah, it's amazing. The technical progress done in the last 15 years, even, it's amazing. Like, it's like the future has arrived, we just don't realize it.
Well, when I did my thesis and was working in Trinity, even when I left in the mid-60s, Trinity did not have a copying machine. There was no copying machine of any sort. If you wanted to make multiple copies, you had to do it either by putting sheets of paper in between and typing through.
Okay, as we're talking about technical progress, then one interesting thing to point out would be how the level of development of the technical progress affected the success rate in interpreting the data. For example, 40 years ago, there was no GPS. You were interpreting the geophysical data just on paper. Now you have super precise positioning system even in your phone, and all the data is electronically collected and interpreted, and all the maps can be made in 3D using various software tools. So the technical progress, did it actually affect the success rate of making discoveries, or is it more or less the same?
I think it lowers the risk factor, is it, more than anything. It probably impacts in two ways. It lowers the risk factor because now you can see more clearly whether you've really got a hope of a prospect or not. It's still not possible generally to image hydrocarbons in the ground. So you're still looking at all the factors that around the hydrocarbons, but not necessarily being sure. But nevertheless, having a clear picture of the structure and what goes on down there is lowering the risk.
The risk of what?
The risk of failure. I mean, a lot of things were drilled in the past that just didn't exist. The picture that had been conceived just wasn't there. That's so one thing, I think.
Do you mean that, for example, if you look at a particular location which has been mapped in 1970s and then you map it in 2017, would you see different things?
Yeah.
Do you mean that some oil reserves might have been noticed 40 years ago.
Oh, certainly. And I mean, one of the big developments in recent years has been via 3D seismic, the ability to see the extent of an oil field. And a lot of reserves have been added to older fields because it can be now seen that there's perhaps another lobe of the structure that still has oil in it, and so on. And it allows you also to better position your drilling targets to properly drain the reservoir. So it's made a huge difference. Whether we're finding, it's difficult to know whether we're actually finding things because of that. I think we are, because we are able to look at subtle things that we wouldn't have been able to target in the past. You can now pick out zones of porosity in rocks that are perhaps pinching out up dip, which you wouldn't have dared drill in the past. So yes, we're finding more in that sense. The bigger targets, of course, we got them, and we'd have found them even, well, we did find them even with the older and rather cruder data.